Hello, I am Charlie Marlow. That is the great Eric Messersmith. This is Everybody Settle Down. Eric, how you doing, man?
Hey, Charlie, I don't know if I deserve that, but I will take it.
Okay, all right, let's get right to it. YouTube podcast. It's all about hitting the hole, and this might tick some people off, but it's interesting. All right, you sent me this article. Now it's election betting odds. I'll put it up here. It's from what is it? It's Maxime Lott and John Stossel, and it actually has Joe Biden right now leading the presidential odds over Donald Trump 45.5% for Biden, 43.6% for Donald Trump, and RFK Jr. is 3.7%. Now you do have Michelle Obama's 2.4%, but the big headline here, and I'll show some more betting odds, but in this particular betting odds site, Joe Biden is actually the favorite, and that's the first time I've seen that in what, a year or so. What do you think?
Yeah, my buddy Matt, who is a Matt T, who is a loyal listener to our podcast, he pointed this out to me because he follows this stuff closely, and I had kind of seen it as well. Basically, what happens is there are these websites that take real bets on outcomes of non-sporting events like presidential elections, right? And so what some of these things do, and the one we're referring to here is called electionbettingodds.com, is they take a bunch of them and kind of um, put them together, kind of like polling aggregate sites do, and give you a number of kind of a consensus. Real Clear Politics does this as well, where they take some sites that, as well where people bet and pull them together to kind of give you a rough sense. And some people say that this is more accurate than polling because polling, as we know, is a snapshot in time. What is happening right now? Whereas this is predictive. This is people actually predicting what will happen based on, in some cases, real money. And Biden's numbers in these polling aggregates that I had seen were really low for a long time. They were down in the upper 20s after the Her report came out. So the odds of Biden winning the presidency, according to these betting sites, were in like the upper 20s, and Trump was in the mid 40s. And you had a lot of money on people like, not a lot, but you had some money on Michelle Obama, on Gavin Newsom, on Gretchen Whitmer, on Kamala Harris, people kind of hedging their bets. What happened after that, we know, is Biden did really well at the State of the Union. And as time has gone on and he's looked maybe like he's up to this, his odds started going up and up and up to the point where they caught up to Trump and now are sort of roughly neck and neck, with Biden even maybe slightly ahead as he is today on this electionbettingodds.com. And that kind of mirrors what we've seen in the polling. And you and I have talked about this. It has not been a surge toward Biden, but that ever since that week where you had Super Tuesday, where essentially Trump clinched the nomination, Haley dropping out the next day, and then the State of the Union the day after that, ever since that week, you have seen a gradual move toward Biden to get him basically caught up to Trump in the national polling. And in fact, if you look on Real Clear Politics today, their average of the most recent polls has Trump up by like point 0.5. So essentially a tie. And that's where we see the betting odds are as well, essentially a tie with a slight edge towards Biden. And I think that's kind of how I feel about the race as well. I think we've talked about this before on every show we've done. If you would have asked me that show, who's going to win the election if it's held today, I would have said Trump, and I would still say that. I think if the election were held today, Trump would probably win because he's roughly even in the popular vote, most likely, judging by the polls, and he has an edge in the electoral college that we saw in 2016 and 2020 as well. So I think Trump would probably win. But if you ask me who do I think will win, I would probably say Biden. I think Biden will probably win, but I'm not super confident of that. And I think the odds of Biden at around 46%, Trump at around 44%, and then everybody else, Kennedy, any other Democrat, any other Republican, around 10% total, I think is that seems fair to me. That seems like roughly how I feel this race is situated as we sit here on April 18th.
Okay, and so because it is April 18th, I was looking today at some other sites, and so Odds Shark. Now their odds were as of April 8th. They had Donald Trump as a slight favorite plus 100. So for people that don't bet. That means if you bet 100, you win $100. Joe Biden is plus 110. So that's very, very close there. Um, Essentially, it's a coin flip. Now, if you go to Odds Checker, and I don't know when they updated theirs, but similar story. Donald Trump is plus 130 and Joe Biden is plus 136. That's really, really close. It's essentially a coin flip. So depending on where you look, you're probably going to see a couple that say Trump is the favorite. We're talking about the election betting odds, which is an aggregate, as you mentioned, which says Joe Biden is the slight favorite. And I will say this though. Now I won't get into the rant again about no legal sports gambling in the state of Missouri, but I will say, as somebody who likes to gamble on sports, and I'm not good at it, and really nobody's good at gambling on sports, but I will say this: I would put much more stock in gambling odds than I would polls, as you mentioned. And here's the big reason: when you hang a number on anything, on any sporting event, whatever it is, there is real, actual money on the line. These sports books, these books do take money on the presidential election. There's real money on the line. So I would look at sports books and betting odds more so and have more confidence in that than I would polling because it actually matters. If you have a bad poll, nobody really cares. If you have a bad line in a sports book, you could lose millions of dollars.
Yeah. Well, and you saw this on 2016 on election night. The odds for the betting odds swung very hard toward Donald Trump fairly early in the evening, like way before people were ready to make calls because of what they saw coming in. That was enough for the betting odds to swing and make a prediction that Trump was probably going to win based on the bets. And of course, that turned out to be the case. And I think they both tell you something, but when you put them together, I think they're telling you at this point, again, in mid April, very similar things, which is this is close. This is really close right now, and it's likely that it's going to be really close when people actually show up to vote 6 months from now. And I think that's probably true. I think we were in a phase before of wish casting about what we hoped, I think, for this election to be. And that was a phase that I think favored Donald Trump. And that was the phase of maybe it'll be somebody else on either side, or maybe it'll be somebody besides these two guys. Maybe no labels will come in. Maybe Biden won't run. Maybe Trump will get indicted. Maybe someone will beat him in the primaries. Maybe, right? That I think favored Trump because Biden is unpopular. I mean, if you look at his approval ratings, they've ticked up a little bit in the last month post State of the Union, but they're still hovering on average in the low 40s. And his net approval, which is disapprove versus approve, is roughly minus 16 or 17 right now. If you look historically, going back all the way to Truman, because we've had Gallup polling all the way back to then, presidents in there at this point in their term, 3+ years in, running for reelection, he is among the worst. And the people with similar numbers to him at this point have all lost. George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, Donald Trump, the first time. They all lost. And so that is why we know he's so vulnerable. And so when people were looking around for any alternative, he was doing very poorly in the polling and the betting odds. But what's happened over the last month is what, if you follow politics, eventually would happen, which is people will realize it's a binary choice. Yes, RFK Jr.'s out there. You've got Jill Stein or Cornel West, or people could not vote. But at the end of the day, only two people, most likely, one of two, are going to be president next January, right? And as that choice kind of hardens in people's minds and it goes more away from wishing and hoping to, okay, this is a binary choice. One of these two guys is going to be the president. I have to make a decision. I've always felt the binary choice phase of the campaign favors Biden and tilts toward Biden. Doesn't mean he's a shoo-in, doesn't mean he's got it wrapped up by any means. I just think when you get into the binary choice phase, which we're starting to get into now, that favors Biden. And I think this week's a great example. Biden, where has Biden been this week? Pennsylvania to campaign. and again is he's scheduled to be in Pennsylvania again today as we're recording this on the 18th, where 15 members of the Kennedy family, including RFK Jr.'s sister, are going to publicly endorse Biden. Where has Trump been this week? In court, where he is again today for jury selection for his New York hush money payment trial, and he'll be there for a while. They still haven't finished jury selection. Who knows how long the trial is going to take? And then after that, he may have another trial this summer. So I think when you now that we're into that phase and you see that contrast show up every day, despite what Trump and his people say, I don't think that is a contrast that wears well for Trump over time.
Yeah, and I want to state that I still think the same, that it's going to come down to the blue wall states in November. However, I do wonder, we talk a lot about the abortion issue, and couple weeks or a month back, we kind of looked at the polls, and we kind of gave Trump all those southern type states, some of them that Biden got in 2020 that we don't think is going to happen again. So we're talking Georgia, and I'm not, Nevada's not southern, but just some of the states that kind of trend more Republican, North Carolina, and I just wonder, and Arizona was in that bucket, but I wonder the abortion thing with Arizona, if that becomes the huge issue there, and if that's on the ballot, I would put Arizona in the blue camp if that's the case. I think that state is close enough that that could swing it. What do you think? Not
Yeah,
Florida though.
look, there are odds about who wins each state too, right? And the odds, which again is different than the polling, the odds of who wins each state, if you look at them right now, Biden is slightly favored in Michigan and Pennsylvania, Trump and Nevada. He's slightly favored. Wisconsin and Arizona are almost 50-50,
Okay.
almost right down the middle, which seems Biden, I think, is a slight tiny favorite in Wisconsin to win Wisconsin. And Trump is, I'm talking like 51-49, 52-48, and Trump a slight tiny favorite to win Arizona. So if you judge it by that, that would lead you to believe that the election is going to come down to those two states, which sounds reasonable to me. Wisconsin and Arizona. Biden would need one. Under that scenario, if you give him Michigan and Pennsylvania, which are not givens. I want to be clear on that. They're going to probably be very close. And who knows with the way that people are responding to the Israel Hamas war, who knows in Michigan in particular, where as we've mentioned, there's a fairly large number of Muslim and Arab American voters. But if the markets are right, the prediction markets are right, and Biden is a favorite in Pennsylvania and Michigan, then it comes down to Wisconsin and Arizona, and Biden would need to win one. If Trump won both, he would be the president. If Biden wins one, he would be the president. And I could see that. If you were asking me today, what is the most likely scenario on election night? It's that. It's that Biden narrowly wins by a sliver Pennsylvania and Michigan, and Wisconsin and Arizona are, within 10,000 or 20 or 30,000 votes either way. And if Biden wins either, he's the president. That's what I think is probably the most likely, scenario as we're 6.5 months out.
All right, you mentioned the Donald Trump trial, the Stormy Daniels hush money case. What impact do you think this will have? I've been paying attention basically through Twitter, and you see Donald Trump make his statement that this is a miscarriage of justice, and then you hear the story that he fell asleep in court. I haven't really been following it that closely. It is sad, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or anything. It is sad that we've gotten to this point that a former US president and a guy who's now running for president is on trial. I think we've normalized some of the craziness in the last 4 or 5 years, whatever it is, but it is pretty stunning. It's something that you feel like happens in other countries, and you talk about third world countries or banana republic. It is odd to see that. I just wonder, even if he did it, I don't think people care. I personally don't care. I do think he did it. We have the evidence of the payment there, that we've seen that, and they write it off as a legal expense. Again, I don't know the legalese of exactly what's going on there. I just wonder if people really care. I don't even think Democrats necessarily care about this one. And I think if we're getting back to talking about how it can impact the election, the one that matters to me is the subverting the 2020 election. If we have 3, 4 trials and he's innocent in all of them, it's going to become the boy who cried wolf to me in terms of public opinion. Don't you think? Like, I think when we get to the one that matters, if we do, people are going to be like, oh my God, I'm so tired of this. What do you think?
So I think in general, Trump does better when these are theoretical. So what I mean
Mhm.
by that is he does better when it's more about general prosecution of him. It's a trial here, it's a argument here, emotion here, and it's hypothetical. It's not real, it's not happening. And it's the argument of, well, I'm being persecuted and all these people are coming after me because I represent you, right? I think that plays better. I don't think it plays as well when you actually are in the trial and you have facts and evidence that at the very least make Trump look bad, right? Put the legal issues aside. The fact that he was banging, allegedly, a porn star while his wife was pregnant and then paying her off and falsifying business records in order to not have it come out before an election at a base level looks bad. And the more that, and again, this is, as you mentioned, of the four trials, this is the least bad for him because it involves a payment to a porn star about about an alleged affair. At the end of the day, it's not that severe in a lot of people's minds. And of the four, I think it is. And not only that, legally, these are felonies, falsifying business records that he's charged with, but they are the lowest level felony in New York, which means even if he's convicted, it's not a guarantee that he would get jail time. So he has no criminal record as of now. That'll probably change down the road. But as of now, he has no criminal record, first time offender. So you could see a scenario where he gets convicted, but gets probation or house arrest or something like that, right? In terms of did he do it, I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, you could see in all of these cases, even this one, there isn't really a I'm innocent defense. Like, you know what I mean? You don't really see that from Trump or his people. They're maybe, when we get to trial, we'll see. Maybe they have some, novel legal theory. And remember, what we're talking about here in this case, and I want to be clear, I've not made my mind up yet. I want to see the trial unfold. But what we're talking about here is election interference, right? You and I have talked on this program about the Hunter Biden laptop, which dropped in October of 2020, and how that was suppressed initially on some social media sites, and how some of the other media was afraid to touch it because they weren't sure if they could verify it, and it came right before the election. And people have said that was election interference. And the reason they say that is because they say that was damaging information about a family member of Joe Biden, maybe even Biden himself, depending on, your view, close to an election. Well, remember where we were 4 years earlier in 2016. The Access Hollywood tape had come out, and that was pretty damaging to Donald Trump at the time. You had Republicans openly criticizing him for that. That was kind of a touch and go moment in that campaign. And then Stormy Daniels' story is out there, right? The Karen McDougal story is out there about these affairs. Now, do I care that Trump had an affair personally? No. But you could see why, if you're Trump and his supporters and you are in a close election and the Access Hollywood tape is out in public, you could see why you wouldn't want an alleged affair with a porn star while your wife is pregnant to come out a month before the election. Okay? Again, do I care about it? No. Do I think most of Trump supporters would have cared if it came out? No. But you could see why they wouldn't want to do it. And in fact, what did they do? Michael Cohen, allegedly, he's pled guilty to this, so I don't even think I have to say allegedly. He paid Stormy Daniels to bury that story. That's what happened. And then Donald Trump allegedly reimbursed him later by falsifying business records in order for that not to come out. We can argue about how severe that is, but is it a legitimate thing? Yeah, I think so. I think it's a legitimate thing to talk about in this context. And does it make Trump look good? No. Now, in terms of the political effect, I keep going back to this because the polls keep telling us this. In the Republican primary, when they ask Republican primary voters, these are not Democrats for the most part, Will you support Donald Trump in the fall if he's convicted of a felony? Consistently, 20, 30% of Haley voters or Republicans overall said no. Now, do I think some of them will come home to Donald Trump? Absolutely. But in these races that are going to be really close in some of these states, Biden doesn't need 20 or 30% of Republicans or Haley voters to sit out or vote for him. He needs a small percentage. And even now, this is a Yahoo poll from earlier this week. National, who do you support, Trump or Biden? It's tied 44-44, similar to other polling we've seen. Same poll, they asked people, if Trump is convicted of a serious crime in the coming months, who will you support? Biden, 45-36. So it goes from tied to Biden up 9. Now, again, do I think that will really happen? No. I don't think Biden would win by 9 points if Trump is convicted. I don't think there's any world where Biden or Trump win by anything like 9 points. I literally don't think anything could happen that would cause that result. But I still believe there are people in the middle. Again, I've said this before. It's crazy to think in 2024 that actually care about, facts. And they actually want to see what happens before they make up their mind. And I know for most of America on the left or right, we've long since abandoned that where things that happen actually matter. But there's still a chunk of people who care about what happens and who care if a guy running for president is convicted of like 80 felonies. That will matter in their vote. And that is why, getting back to our first topic, I think it is fair to say Biden's prospects for the future are better than where we sit right now. And this is a big reason why, because these trials, at the very least, are going to make Trump look bad. And worst case scenario is this polling is right. And there's a segment of Americans who say, you know what? I just can't go there with this guy who is, if it happens, convicted of all these felonies.
Did you ever watch Arrested Development, the TV show?
Yes. Yes.
Great show. I know why I was laughing because when you basically said that this is a felony, but it's the lowest level felony, and you might not do jail time. There's a line from that show where the patriarch of the family, he calls up, I think, the Jason Bateman, the son character, and goes, "I may have committed some light treason." And I know I always laugh about that. So here's what's funny. I really I try not to be whataboutism guy, but the reason I think through that lens is because I try to think of the other side and how they process it and how I would process it. And I think it's very important that you brought up that it's election interference because when everybody's talking about the Hunter Biden laptop, I've said 5 million times 100% Democrats and Biden, they were wrong. That was wrong to suppress that. What always bothers me is hypocrisy because I have brought that up in conversations on the radio over the last 2, 3, 4 years. I said, look, just be fair about it because exactly what happened with Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, those stories were caught and killed. They were paid off
Mm-hmm.
so that those stories would not negatively impact the election. Now, if you want to do the whataboutism, which one's worse, I don't even care about that. But it's more about I hate when people only point to one of those and not the other. So I'm glad you brought that up. I also, and again, I'm talking about this in a whataboutism way because I think both sides kind of go, yeah, like, okay, Donald Trump slept with a porn star. Okay, Bill Clinton was banging everybody. Okay, all right, everybody does it. The documents. Okay, now clearly it's not the same, but to other people, it's the same. Oh, Pence did it. Joe Biden did it. Everybody does it. That's why at the end of all of this, the one that matters is subverting the election to me, because that's one that is totally different. So I don't know. I haven't even been following this case that much, just kind of through Twitter. Um, I agree with you; it's a bad look, but don't you think everybody knows he did this in terms of having the affair? It's a bad look, but I've even
Right.
seen people. I follow a lot of people on the right on Twitter, and now it's more about, hey, they're going after him. This is election interference because he can't campaign, but also it's like powerful men always do this, and that is kind of true, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think, look, again, do I care personally about an affair? Certainly not. Do I care about a hush money payment for an affair? No, not really. I don't really even care about that. But I think it's important to remember, if you're going to describe the trial, I'm not saying you personally, if one is going to describe the trial, right, and have any opinion on it, fine, have your opinion, whatever, but at least describe it accurately. And I just
Yeah.
think it's important to say these things. Trump is not on trial for having an affair. That is not a crime. He's not charged with that. He is not even on trial for a hush money payment because that is not a crime. It is not a crime to pay someone off for a non-disclosure. People do it all the time. It's not a crime to catch and kill a story like they did with the Karen McDougal story. None of that is charged here. What Trump is accused of is falsifying business records, right? By lying about what he was making a payment for and doing that to cover up a federal campaign finance violation, which is not acknowledging what he was doing. If Trump had just come out and said, "Hey, I'm paying this woman off. Here it is. I'm writing the checks," he would not be sitting where he is today. And so, if you say it's not a big deal or he shouldn't be convicted or the case shouldn't be brought, all of that is fine. You're entitled to that opinion. You may be right. We'll see what happens at the end of the day in the trial, but at least acknowledge what he is accused of. I mean, could you imagine if it's not exactly the same thing, but what if Joe Biden had gotten wind of the Hunter Biden laptop and he had gone to Giuliani and been like, "We'll pay you 200 grand to bury this story. And then I'm going to falsify documents on campaign finance disclosure." I mean, could you imagine how outraged people would be? Hell, let's do apples to apples. Let's say Biden had an affair and a woman a month before the election in 2020 was going to come out publicly and announce that. And Biden paid her hush money and falsified business records about it, allegedly. And then it came out later. Do you think some of the Trump supporters would be so quick to give Biden a pass for that? Do you think that'd be like, well, it's private sexual behavior. Who cares? It doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? Of course they wouldn't. They would be saying the same things that the anti-Trump people are saying now. And you know they would if Biden had engaged. And that's the same thing with the documents. At the end of the day, look, was Biden careless with the documents? Yes. But as the Hur report points out in detail, if anyone takes the time to read it, what Biden did with documents and what Trump did are completely different. And that is why one of them is facing criminal charges for it and one of them is not. It's not because of lawfare. It's not because of, Merrick Garland out to get Donald Trump. It's because their actions were different. Now, again, you could still say, I still think Trump is innocent. He had a right to these documents, whatever defense they're going to launch at trial, which I don't think will work, but they're entitled to make their defense. But what you can't say is the behavior is the same, or at least you can't say it and be credible, right? I mean, anybody can say whatever they want. But if you look at the facts, and that's why I say when you early on, when the facts are muddied and there's no trial, that is when Trump can play off these things and there's no counter to him, right? There's no actual evidence yet. There's no trial. And I think it benefited him in that stage. Certainly it benefited among Republicans. I don't think there's any, I mean, you could argue that's the key reason he won the primaries. These indictments rallied Republicans to his cause who might otherwise have supported DeSantis or Haley. But now that it's a choice between Trump and Biden, and now that going to be in court, and now that people are going to be testifying, and now the Trump people actually have to make legal arguments, right? Because in court, you can't just get up there and say, well, my client's being persecuted because this district attorney doesn't like him. Because in court, that doesn't matter. The judge and the jury don't give a shit if the district attorney likes Trump or doesn't like him. All that matters in court, or that should matter, is the evidence, is the testimony. It's not about, well, Merrick Garland is trying to get me, or this is a witch hunt. Like, that stuff doesn't work in court. You actually have to have facts and evidence. And that's what I've said before on all these trials. When you get into the facts evidence stage, which we're still not even in yet, we're still in jury selection of trial one, it's going to be a bad look for Trump. And it's going to be hard for him, I think, to overcome this as we go through the summer. Not impossible, because as I said, Biden has his issues, as we all know, as we have discussed at length. So it's not impossible that Trump could overcome this. I just think it's going to be really tough.
Yeah, this gets back also. I agree with you in the sense of there are people out there. in the middle, truly in the middle, that'll ping pong their vote back and forth from year to year, Democrat, Republican, whoever, and they do care about the facts, and I think that's great, and I do think those folks are going to actually determine this election because I'm laughing. I've had so many conversations with some of my very good friends who are Republicans, and we're talking smart people, successful people, and they just say now, I'll be like, well, don't you think Trump tried to overturn the election? And they're like, yeah, but it doesn't matter. Like,
Right.
this is no, I'm serious. Like they now
I
acknowledge
believe
that.
you.
Now they might not acknowledge it in public, like on the radio, but like I have friends and we have group texts. We're always talking about politics and whatnot. And they're like, yeah, he did try to overturn the election, but in their opinion, Biden is so bad. Everything is so bad right now, and immigration is the border is so bad that they don't care. So I mean, I make the argument, well, I mean, he tried to overturn the election. And I just think we're at this point of polarization where for a good 40% of each side, like nothing really matters. Like they're not going to divorce from their side almost over anything. They're dug in. So that's where the 20% or the 15% or the 10%, whatever that middle is, I do think there's the middle out there that's going to decide this. And you know what? That's what America should be about still.
Oh, I agree. And I think what you just pointed out is what I talked about earlier working for Trump. The binary choice, what you talked about, those are people who you're describing. They understand, they get the concept of a binary choice, and they may not love Trump. A lot of Trump's voters don't love Trump. They'll tell you publicly or especially privately all the many flaws about Trump, but then still say, but I like him more. Because why do they do that? Because they understand the concept of a binary choice. They know that either Trump or Biden's going to be the president and they prefer Trump. So in that way, it works for Trump. But I think overall, the net gain of this election getting into a binary choice works for Biden. And I think it works for him because there's a lot of people who don't love Biden. We see that in his approval rating, who will vote for him anyway because of the chaos and we'll see potential unlawfulness of Donald Trump. And they'll just be like, you know what? I just can't do it. Now, I think you made another key point, which is that is alone will not be enough for Biden. That will get him close. But what he's going to have to, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of people who they either don't care at all about trying to overturn the election January 6th, or they don't care that much. They care more about inflation and taxes and the economy. And look, I get that. If you're especially if you're struggling right now, the concept of kind of let's protect democracy, that maybe doesn't resonate with you as much as, well, I went to the grocery store yesterday and things cost $100 more than the same shit cost 3 years ago. Or I
Mhm.
can't buy a house because interest rates are high. Or, my car loan is I'm getting 11 or 12% interest. I get it. Like, and that is where Biden and his people, and I think they are starting to realize this in their messaging. The Trump legal issues slash January 6th slash trying to overturn an election, which I think is a really big deal. And I know they think is a really big deal. At the end of the day, that's not good. There's a limit to how effective that argument can be and how many people that can reach. There's a lot of people that can reach. There's a lot of Haley voters that can reach, and you should message to them. But that can't be your only message. And I would even argue it shouldn't even be your primary message. Trump being in court all year, if that happens, that's going to be enough. People are going to see that. They're going to read about that. You're not going to have to pound that argument over the head because it's going to be in the news every day, especially, as you said, if the January 6th case goes to trial, which I think there's a pretty good chance it will. That one is the big one. That's the most significant one. I think that's the most damaging one to Trump. But if you're the Biden people, that argument's going to be made in courtrooms. You need to make the argument of, okay, here is why I am better economically than Donald Trump going forward on taxes, on inflation. And you saw, I think Biden starting to make that message this week. He was in Pennsylvania and Scranton, where he talked a lot about the economy and framed it as he should. Here is what I want to do on tax policy going forward, and here is what Donald Trump wants to do. Here is why my ideas are better. That is the case he needs to make. And he even had a good line. He said, because I think with Trump, the key is don't get in the mud with Trump. I think people who get in the mud, like I remember Marco Rubio during the primary, like in 2016, was insulting Trump's hand size and even made reference to like the size of his, And I'm like,
Yeah.
are we serious here? Like Marco Rubio, who if you follow him, like he's a fairly serious guy. He's the ranking member in the Senate Intelligence Committee. Like he's a pretty serious, thoughtful guy. And the moment I saw him starting to make fun of Trump's hand size, I'm like, he's done. Now he would have
Mhm.
lost anyway. I want to be clear. That wasn't what lost him the race, but it was just so embarrassing. And it's like when you get in that level, you've lost. If you're on that level with Trump, you're lost. He's going to beat you at that. That's his game, right? That's what he does. But I think what does work is kind of light ribbing. And Biden had a good line the other day where because the True Social stock has collapsed. It was like it got up to like $79 a share. It's in the 20s now. And Trump, of course, owns a large chunk of that stock. So he's lost billions on paper in the last week and a half. And Biden said if the Truth Social stock keeps performing like this, Trump's going to be better off under my tax plan than he is under his. Those kind of things, those kind of lines, I think, are the way that you kind of attack Trump with kind of the light ribbing. Leave the other stuff to the trials and, the outside noise.
Okay, on that note, so you remember a month or so ago when Donald Trump apparently won the club championship at Mar-a-Lago, and I think he won maybe the overall, but also his age group. And look, he's probably a good golfer, and I would think for his age group, let's give him credit for that. For a
Yeah,
dude
that's true.
80, probably pretty damn good golfer. But
Yeah.
I remember, so he put that out there, whether it was Truth Social, whatever. I'm not on Truth Social, but I do follow an account on Twitter or X that basically posts all of Donald Trump's truths, right? Because you do want to follow the guy who's running for president. And so when that news came out that Donald Trump won the club championship, Biden or the White House said something like in a tweet, and I'll find it, but it was like, "Congratulations, that's a nice accomplishment." And I couldn't tell if they were being sarcastic or not. And like, I'm dead serious. Even right now, I don't know if that was actually in this mud throwing terrible election where everybody says awful things about each other. I didn't know if they were actually, hey, you know what? That's impressive. Or if it was sarcastic and you're like, oh, great, you're focused on golf. So I really don't know, but either way, it was funny. And I think Biden looks kind of good either way. Hey, you're complimenting him. You're trying to be nice amongst all the hellfire that's going, or you have a nice little dig, like you said.
Yeah, my take on that, because I saw that, was that it was a dig, but I
Okay.
like see, but here's the thing about Biden is again, when he was younger and even now, like he does have a pretty affable way about him when he's at his best and a pretty dry sense of humor that can be funny. Whether that's him or his speechwriters, who knows, right? But like I said, the line about his tax plan, that kind of thing, those little jabs, first of all, we know they get under Trump's skin, right? I mean, look how he reacts to people like Jimmy Kimmel, making jokes about him. But I think that's the way to go after Trump. I think trying to pile on about again, I want to be clear. I think that trying to overturn the election is a big deal. Okay. I want to put that on record. However, if I was running a campaign against Trump, would I lead with that right now? I don't think I would. I would mention it. I would try to appeal to the voters, particularly kind of the disgruntled Haley voters, the suburbanites, the college educated people that might appeal to. But I would focus my efforts on the economy, on what you can do going forward. We all know where we've been over the last 4 years. We all know the struggles that we have had. But I would focus on the forward-looking message, the compare and contrast, and I would take the jabs at Trump about things like that because there's some silliness with Trump. I mean, there just is. Pointing it out, making fun of him, I think that's an effective way to do that versus trying to do a fiery speech about the collapse of democracy. I think it's more effective to be like sometimes to have the light touch. I think is more effective.
Okay, some crime stats. Murders down about 20% here in 2024 compared to last year. FBI data, it was crime in big cities, so more than a million people dropped 11% in 2023. So obviously that's good news. If you go back to 2022, it was obvious Republicans were running on on crime and immigration. And I don't want to say the crime thing has gone away, but clearly the crime statistics have improved. Immigration, and I'm sorry, talking about for Democrats, has not. So it's understandable why Republicans would now shift to really focusing on immigration. That's where you can really get Joe Biden. My thing on the crime, and I live in St. Louis. You live in Los Angeles. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, so I would go to Detroit for any big time event. If we're going to a baseball game, I'm going to Detroit. So it wasn't exactly like I'm around the greatest cities in the United States of America. I'd go to Cleveland, I'd go to Detroit, and I live in St. Louis. I've I feel like I lived in Lansing, Peoria, Toledo, all just cities that have urban centers, and there's some crime. I feel like I've always lived in places that have a decent amount of crime. I've never felt terribly unsafe or anything, but that's kind of how I feel about this issue. I feel like sometimes the media, and I get it, but the media on the right sometimes portrays it like you can't even go into a city, like you're going into Baghdad, you're going to get
Right.
murdered the second you go into the city. And by the way, just so everybody knows, don't take this out of context, we have we have crime issues in St. Louis. We absolutely do. The carjackings and car theft is a huge issue. It happened to my wife actually last year even. So that's a huge issue. But I do think sometimes the coverage doesn't match what's actually going on. In the last couple weeks, my wife and I went downtown to go to dinner. I went downtown for opening day. Now that's a different story. Opening day is a holiday in St. Louis, but still, to me, you can go to sporting events, you can go to shows, concerts, we go see comedians, restaurants, and all that. When I go to downtown St. Louis, hey, I do. I'll pay extra to park my car in a spot where I feel safe. 100%. I will pay an extra 20 bucks, whatever it is, to park safely. But I don't think everyone should always fear going into any city. And I think sometimes people feel that way because of media coverage.
Yeah, well, first of all, that is a sign of why you have so much appeal to every man, because you have these roots in these tough urban cities where you're not a coastal elite, like I am living out here in Los Angeles. So that is part of your appeal. Yeah, you would think by some of the coverage like that if I went to like downtown LA that I would be walking into like a post-apocalyptic hellscape, with like I would have to come in with armor and that's not the case. But that said, we do have a crime problem in our big cities, mainly dealing with property crime, with theft, carjackings. That is a real thing. It's a real thing where you look, because I lived in St. Louis. I live near downtown and I spent some time in downtown. My wife worked in downtown. So I saw firsthand some things. I had my car broken into. I know other people had their cars stolen. I mean, yeah. And here in LA, there's definitely a homelessness issue. That is a real thing. So there are real issues and we should acknowledge those and talk about them, but we also should put them into perspective. And the crime rates overall, especially for violent crime, are way down. We talked about this last week when we did our kind of, the sky is not falling on every single thing in American life segment. If you look at crime peaked in like the late 90s, it has gone down substantially since then. During COVID, 2020, crime went way up and even into 2021. And as you and I have talked about before, and so people will write books about this in the future of the years 2020 and 2021, like of the way that I think, there was something going on besides just a pandemic. And what I mean by that is that pandemic and that death and that isolation we felt and kind of like the all of the psychological aspects of that, I think really caused a lot of weird shit to happen. Like traffic accidents, traffic deaths went way up even though nobody was driving. And so for whatever reason, crime went crazy in 2020 and 2021. And now last year, as you point out, the FBI recorded for the data we have from 2023, the largest drop in the murder rate in the United States. I think it was 13% that we have seen since they started recording data. That has not gotten a ton of play, but look, as we talk about a lot in this show, let's talk about all of it. Yes, crime is up in some areas, particularly property crime. Theft is a big problem out here in Southern California where I live. But at the same time, violent crime and murder down. And as you mentioned, in the first 3 months of this year, in a lot of big cities, that trend has even accelerated down even more. So just let's be fair. Let's celebrate where we're making progress, but also acknowledge where we have more work to do.
Right, and that's all I want. My favorite word is fair. I just like context and I like perspective. And when I say this, people are like, "Oh, you're putting your head in the sand," and that's not the case at all. By the way, first baseball game I ever went to, Detroit Tigers. It was probably 1990, maybe 89, 91, whatever year it was. We took our camper, we took our Winnebago, and my dad, who I love to death, but he's on the frugal side. So what do? Instead of paying, back then, what, 5, 10 bucks, whatever it was to park, he's like, no, I'm going to park for free. So what did he do? He parked, 6, 7, 8 blocks from Tiger Stadium. We get back after a great ball game. Somebody had thrown a rock through the window of our Winnebago. Now,
Mm.
luckily, there was nothing to steal other than some pots and pans. My point is, and I know you were joking about it, but like it's Detroit. It's the city of Detroit. It's kind of always like that. Like it's not good. It's not good. It
Right.
just is what it is. And that's why I've had so many arguments with my folks on the radio show the last couple of years because I do think there's this painting of the picture that downtown St. Louis is Baghdad and it's the worst it's ever been. And I'm thinking I've lived here what since 2008. I've lived here 16 years. I've kind of always thought it was like this. Like there's just
Right.
there's look, there's places that I didn't want to go in 2008. I still don't want to go to those same neighborhoods in 2016. I feel good going to the Cardinals game if I park in the patio's lot. I feel good going to the Fox Theater to see a comedian if I park in the lot. I went downtown, I parked in a lot. Again, we have problems, but I'm like, St. Louis has kind of always been a little sketchy, right? I mean, come on now.
Oh, let me tell you, when I lived there, I think this happened in 2018. I lived in Soulard. Our St. Louis listeners will know where that is. So near downtown, but a fairly nice area. At least it was then. Like, it wasn't cheap to live in Soulard. And one morning I came out and my car was on blocks. Someone had just taken the wheels and tires just right off my car. It was on blocks. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And I'm in a fairly decent area, but near downtown. So look, crime is real. It is absolutely a thing for people to be concerned about. I think particularly when you have prosecutors, I think this is a real thing. We have one out here in LA, George Gascon, who is up for election this year, who is one of these George Soros funded DAs who the right always complain about. And there's truth to this. Where we raised in California the threshold for shoplifting up to $950. If you steal under that, it's not a felony. And so people are just getting out. They're not being prosecuted to the extent they should be. And it's created some sense of lawlessness with stealing here in California. That is absolutely true. And I think it's ridiculous. But we can say that and we could talk about that while also acknowledging the tremendous progress that's been made, on decreasing murders over the last year and a half. Like it doesn't have to be all terrible or like we're living in some utopia. Those are not the only two options.
Well, speaking of all terrible, you probably did see over the weekend that World War III was trending when you heard about these strikes coming from Iran. And I wonder, do you think I know they have the Iron Dome and we have this great missile defense with the United States to help out Israel, but when I saw this and I saw basically that Iran fired all these missiles and they didn't really do any damage. I'm thinking to myself, was this for show? Is this so Iran can basically tell their people and probably through state media lie about what actually happened and say, "Hey, we had a big response to the strike on the consulate." Because to me, like I think we all understand escalation, and if Iran would have had this strike that just created so much more terror in Israel. That's what escalates this thing, just where all of a sudden you start to think about, well, what does the United States have to do? To me, it felt like because whatever day that was, Saturday, we're all thinking, Jesus, what's going to happen tonight? And then you got people going, it's World War III. World War III is trending. It seemed like the United States and Israel are able to disarm essentially everything. To me, it felt like Iran had to show they did something about it without really doing something about it to escalate it further. What do you think?
I think that's generally true. I think that's look, Iran, I don't think there's any question. They calibrated this attack to accomplish two things. Number one, send a strong message that they were doing something, which look, this was the first time that Iran had ever launched an attack against Israel from its own territory. Before they had always used their proxies in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. So in that regard, it was a big deal. But clearly, with the buildup of waiting days and days and days and giving Israel and the United States a chance to pre-position the assets to shoot down these potential missiles and drones, and then launching it, targeting areas for the most part away from city centers. Like they didn't send all these bombs to Tel Aviv, right? That would have been a different thing if they would have gone after Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. So I think in that regard, they were clearly trying to calibrate it just right so that it would be a credible response by them, but not something that would ignite a larger war. And I think that probably is what's going to happen. We'll see. We'll see. But do I think they thought 99% of them would either fail on the launch pad or be shot down? I don't think they did. I think that was probably a surprise. I think they expected to do a little bit. Now they knew that a lot of them would be shot down, clearly. But I don't think they thought of the 300 missiles and drones they sent that 99% of them wouldn't hit the target. I don't think they expected that. And I think that was a big win for Israel, for the United States, for our partners in the region, that we showed how effective we were at shooting down not just the drones, which take a long time, they take hours and hours to get there, but also shooting down the ballistic missiles, which was a pretty big deal at the rate that we did, where no one was killed, and very little damage done. We'll see how Israel responds now, but if you look at that exchange where Israel hit the consulate in Syria, the Iranian consulate, killing several high-ranking officials in the Revolutionary Guard of Iran, and then the counter, that sequence was a win for Israel. I don't think there's any doubt about it, especially considering that also Jordan helped out. An Arab country there that borders Israel. They have been very critical about Israel's actions in Gaza, but yet they were there to help. And I think there is a sense in that region that Iran is, and I think it's the correct sense. I think it's obvious Iran is the major problem in that area. And anything that binds everybody else together against Iran and moves us in that direction, I think is a good thing. So this was a win for Israel. This was a tremendous success. We'll see how they respond because there's a fine line here. You need to deter Iran, but if you go too far in that deterrence, this thing's on a tinderbox right now, and maybe you do ignite that World War III, and maybe we're drawn into that, and that is the worst case scenario. And so, walking that fine line of making sure Iran knows that they can't go too far, but also not going so far yourself that Israel does something that maybe pulls us in. And that is clearly what Biden doesn't want. And I think what most Americans don't want. I don't think too many Americans are anxious for American troops to be fighting in a war in the Middle East. I don't think there's much appetite for that.
100%. The World War III thing is kind of another one of my pet peeves. And again, I really focus a lot on media coverage because it bothers me, and both sides do this. But I feel like, and look, we're here on YouTube. If we did a title of a video, "Are you afraid of World War III?" It's going to get more clicks. And I
That's
get it.
that's what we should call this one, even though we didn't
No,
talk about it till the end.
well, we'll break off a chunk here. We'll do a little clip. But no, I'm just thinking like, you know how wars are now fought. There's a reason we haven't had World War III, and World War II ended 80 years ago. And we dropped the nukes, and I think everybody realized what could happen if that happens again. And then even the way wars are fought now, you know, as you mentioned, neither side, Democrats or Republicans in the United States, want our troops anywhere near these places. Now there's a divide about, hey, should we fund some of these wars? I'm fine with helping our allies and funding them. It's a totally different story to me about putting our troops in harm's way. I do think that the World War III nuclear war, oh, we should be scared. I think that gets played up all the time. It got played up with Russia and Ukraine. It's getting played up now. It'll get played up the next time something happens. But I think it's very important to note, as we always talk about how this impacts the election. All these things are bad for Biden, and it's a win for Trump because it's fair. It's a fair narrative to say things felt calmer under Trump. Now, I understand we were in Afghanistan the whole time still. That had calmed down. Some people, some troops still died over those 4 years. But just from a general narrative standpoint, it is absolutely fair to say, you know what? It seemed like the world and the axis of evil, they were kept in check a little better under Donald Trump. The world does seem to be more on fire, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, and now Israel and Hamas. The world seems to be more on fire under Biden. Is that because he's weak and he's old and he's feeble? I think that's a very fair argument to make, and it's a compelling argument. So anytime things happen overseas in foreign policy, and we keep seeing more things happen. I think again, you don't want to say win loss, but it's in the win column for Trump in terms of the election.
Yeah, look, it's such a complicated question because we'll never know, right? It's not like we can run a simulation where what if Donald Trump had been reelected? Does Russia go into Ukraine? Does the same thing happen with Hamas and Israel on October 7th? Who knows, right? I mean, look, the reason that some people speculate that Hamas did what they did is because Saudi Arabia was getting close to a long-term normalization of relations with Israel, which would have been an historic event in the Middle East to have one of the biggest, most powerful Arab countries in that region fully recognize and have diplomatic relations with a Jewish state. It would have been unprecedented. And I think that still will happen someday. But that was what Trump was trying to do as well. I mean, you had the Abraham Accords under Trump, where some of the smaller Arab countries made a lasting peace with Israel. So Trump, we know, was pushing Saudi Arabia for that as well. So would it have happened? Who knows, right? But the point is, we are where we are now. And for Biden now, I think the worst case scenario is what we mentioned is that Israel and Iran, something happens there where we feel like we have to come into an open conflict in the Middle East. If he can avoid that and Israel can finish up their operations in Gaza with Hamas no longer around, maybe the hostages are freed somehow. That's kind of the best case scenario, I think, for Biden heading into the election. But I think no matter who the president is, no matter what would have happened in an alternate reality, at some point, Russia, Iran, and China we're all going to test, and still probably will in the future, kind of the international order that we've established, that we have led as America. That was going to happen no matter how elections turn out. And these countries are working more and more in a coordinated way. Russia, after all the sanctions that were imposed on it with Ukraine, all the American companies pulled out, many of them, and Russia turned to China. And that's what's kept Russia afloat is China has brought in all of these exports into Russia to replace what they lost from America, and Russia's selling them oil, and they've become closer and closer. Same thing with Iran selling oil to China. And I think one of the big developments this week to kind of tie this all together is that not only were we successful in helping Israel defend itself against the attack from Iran, which I think sent a big message, but also finally, it looks like the House this weekend is going to pass aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Exactly the areas we're talking about. Because the key, my phrase today is binary choice, right? You'd be dead if you played a drinking game where I've said that. You had to drink every time I said that this show. But in foreign policy, it's not a binary choice between either America retreats and does nothing and just lets the world go as it is, or we send our troops all over the world to fight and die. Like those are not the only two options, and neither of them are good options. There is the middle option, which is the appropriate one, which is we use our power and influence to help our allies and contain our adversaries. And Russia and China and Iran are not going to stop. They're not going to stop if Donald Trump is president. They may change their tactics, they may do things differently, but the fight of our time is free nations led by America and others versus totalitarian regimes led by China and Russia and Iran. That is it. That is the game we are in. And so I think the best development this week is finally Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is going to put this bill on the floor. It's going to pass. And Ukraine, especially, who's suffered some setbacks recently because they're literally running out of bullets, is going to get aid. Israel's going to get aid. Taiwan's going to get aid because pulling away from the world and letting Putin have Ukraine and letting Iran do what they want and letting China take Taiwan is absolutely the opposite of what we should be doing. So I've been hard on Speaker Johnson before, and I've said, the Republicans are in chaos, which I think they are. But I want to give him credit because after a rocky start, he is starting to find his rhythm. And he passed a government funding bill that, avoided a government shutdown. And now it looks like he's going to pass this despite a threat to have the chair vacated, which essentially would mean he would lose his job and the House wouldn't have a speaker anymore. That may happen. That may happen this weekend. And he knows that, and he's doing this anyway. And so I want to give Johnson credit because I've been critical of him before for having the cojones to look down, to stare the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world in the face and say, you know what? No, I'm going to do what I think is right and let the chips fall where they may, which is what he said yesterday. And I just want to read this quote from Johnson because I thought this was so good. He said this yesterday. He said, "This is a critical time right now, a critical time on the world stage. I can make a selfish decision and do something that's different, but I'm doing here what I believe to be the right thing. I think providing lethal aid to Ukraine right now is critically important. I really do. I really do believe the intel and the briefings that we've gotten. I believe that Xi of China, Vladimir Putin, and Iran are really an axis of evil. I think they're in coordination on it." And he's right. And if you don't respond in Ukraine and you let Putin win, what message do you send to Iran? What message do you send to China? And so I give Mike Johnson a lot of props because he's risking his job to do the right thing. And we don't see that a lot in politics anymore. We sure as hell don't see it much in the Republican Party. So kudos to him.
All right. Well, we're close to an hour here. You want to empty the notebook? I know you mentioned earlier that RFK Jr. is not very popular amongst his own family, even. So what else do you have?
Yeah, I do think that's interesting because Biden, I think, is in a bind of how he goes after RFK Jr. because you don't want to make him into a bigger deal than he is. And if you, as the sitting president, start attacking him forcefully, like you're elevating him, right? And also, Biden's very close to the Kennedy family. Like he has a bust of RFK Jr.'s dad, Robert Kennedy, in the Oval Office. And so I think this is the way to do it. You don't attack RFK Jr. yourself. You let his family do it for you. You know what I mean? Like I think that's the way to send the message of, hey, getting back to what I said earlier, RFK Jr. is interesting. Whatever. But at the end of the day, he's not going to be the president. It's either going to be me, if you're Biden, or Trump. Come on. And I think that's probably the right way to handle it for now. Now, if RFK Jr. ever spikes in the polls for whatever reason, that's a different story. Then you got to go after him. So I think that's interesting. I think how both Trump and Biden respond to RFK, who's still getting, in some polls, he's down at 2 or 3%, but at others, he's at 10 or 12. So who knows? But he's still getting a significant chunk. So I think that's one of the really interesting things to watch this summer is how both of them go after RFK Jr. and if they go after him at all. The only other thing, what else did I want to mention? Oh, the Mayorkas impeachment, the trial that wasn't that happened the day before we recorded, where they didn't really even have a trial. They just basically dismissed the charges in party line votes in the Senate. You and I talked about this before. On the one hand, that impeachment was ridiculous. It was essentially an impeachment over someone who you don't think did a very good job, who was doing what their administration and their boss wanted them to do. On the other hand, I don't love the precedent of if you get an impeachment in the Senate, you just kind of throw it out without having any discussion about it at all. I think there was probably a middle ground there where they could have allowed the House impeachment managers to have maybe 2 or 3 hours, let them make their best case, and then vote on the charges, which we know there was no chance he was going to get convicted. I think if you had done that, you would have had several Republicans, Mitt Romney and a few others, who would have voted with the Democrats to acquit Mayorkas because they know what is clear that this is a joke of an impeachment, and it isn't there. It's just based on basically policy disagreements, which is why we have elections, right? And if they impeach Mayorkas, the next person in there would do the exact same thing. Are they going to impeach him too? And hell, I guess you could impeach Biden for that too, right? Because he's ultimately the one who sets the policy. So I wish they would have handled that a little bit differently. But in the end, I think the result was right, which is we have really important shit going on right now. Like these bills to fund Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan that the Senate's going to need to pass this week. We can't be tied up for weeks on an impeachment trial that is, basically ridiculous.
Agreed. And you know this too, though. A lot of this is political theater, and I agree with you. I don't think Biden or Mayorkas has done a good job on the border at all. But unfortunately, that's not impeachable. That means you vote those people out. But again, when we talk about just the political theater of impacting the election, I feel like anytime immigration is being talked about, it's a win for Donald Trump. And when you heard the headlines from that, and you keep hearing the name Laken Riley, and Mayorkas was asked, "Do you know Laken Riley?" Those are wins for the Republican Party. Those are wins for Donald Trump. I don't agree with it. I think it's stupid. But when we're playing a game of back and forth politics, I understand why Republicans are doing that, even though I don't agree with it. All right, let's
Oh,
end
Charlie,
on
can I
that one.
one
Go ahead.
one more quick thing, because I liked if I say something wrong, which I do, I like to correct it. This isn't a huge deal, but last week we talked about how things aren't as bad as people, make them out to be, and
So
I
wait,
talked
they
about
are they are as bad?
no, they're not as bad.
Okay.
I talked about houses, and I said that houses used to be really small, which is true, right? And people always say in the 1950s you could buy a house. I said they were 1,500 square feet back then in the 1950s. I was wrong. I looked it up. The average house in the 1950s, 950 square feet.
Whew.
So yes, people could buy houses in the 1950s fairly easily. They also were on average 950 square feet. Just
That
some
was my
perspective.
first. That's basically the first condo I ever bought in Brentwood Forest. That's about. I think it was about 950, 2 bedroom, one bath. Yeah. Yeah. All right, buddy. Well, good stuff. Everybody settle down. Episode, whatever it is. It's like 13, 14, something like that. I'll look it up. But great stuff. If you're watching or listening, comment, like, subscribe, share the show, share the channel in your group text, put it on social media. We're growing. Eric, we've had a good like 2, 3 weeks. We're starting to go like this. So great job, and we'll see you next week.